history has always been shaped by war. And through the ages, some battles have decided the fate of nations and still affect the way we live today. These are the great battles. "700 years ago, Scotland was locked in a bloody struggle for independence from England. The war was to climax here on the banks of the Bannockburn, near the city of Stirling. Over the course of 2 days in June 1314, 7,000 Scots outmaneuvered and outfought an English army 18,000 strong. After this great battle, England was forced to recognize Scotland as an independent and sovereign nation. The building being constructed behind me here in Edinburgh is the new home of Scotland's Parliament. Today, Scotland is still part of the United Kingdom, but in July 1997, the Scottish people voted for devolution. Scotland's first parliament in almost 300 years was convened in the capital city in 1999. The creation of today's modern Scottish Parliament is the result of a peaceful and democratic process. But over the centuries, Scotland and England have had a very troubled and often violent relationship. In 1296, England invaded Scotland. After 2 years of vicious fighting, the Scots were eventually defeated, and the country was occupied by its more powerful neighbour. At the beginning of the 14th century, one man began a campaign to liberate his country and build an independent Scotland. Robert Bruce was born into a powerful Scottish noble family in 1273. From an early age, he was trained as a soldier. At his prime, Bruce was rated one of the best knights in Christendom. But he was no saint. Robert Bruce was born in an age when betrayal, double-dealing, and assassination were part of everyday life. Bruce may have been a natural statesman and a superb soldier, but he was also a product of his age. And as a result, he could be utterly ruthless. Bruce had a distant birthright to the Scottish crown and desperately wanted to be king. At first, he thought the best way of achieving this was to side with the English, but quickly changed his mind. Instead, he decided to back independence and take the crown by force. In 1306, Bruce met with one of his main rivals for the Scottish throne, Sir John Comyn. But the two men soon began to argue, and in a violent rage, Bruce stabbed Comyn and left him bleeding for his henchmen to finish him off. The murder had dire consequences for Bruce. The fact that Comyn had been killed inside a church on sacred ground led to him being excommunicated by the Pope. In the 14th century, this was just about the worst thing that could happen to a noble, let alone a man who wanted to be king. Shortly after the murder, Bruce made a full confession, and the Church of Scotland, which backed Scottish independence, forgave him. Absolved of his sins, Bruce was crowned King of the Scots on the 25th of March, 1306. But Comyn's murder had made Bruce deeply unpopular with many Scots. To make matters worse, the English ordered his arrest. Bruce was forced to go on the run. He spent the next 3 years as an outlaw in his own kingdom. By 1309, Bruce had either beaten most of his Scottish opponents in battle or had persuaded them to join him in his quest for an independent Scotland. Bruce and his supporters controlled much of the countryside, but the English still held all the major towns and castles. Bruce continued his guerrilla war against the English. Relying on night attacks, ambushes, and lightning raids, Bruce's army gradually liberated Scotland. After 5 years of fighting, there remained only one obstacle to overcome. Stirling Castle dominates central Scotland. It had been besieged by Bruce's brother Edward for almost a year. In accordance with the rules of medieval warfare, the garrison's English commander had agreed to surrender to the Scots if the castle wasn't relieved by the 25th of June, 1314. Bruce was furious with his brother. He knew that it was only a matter of time before the English arrived in force to relieve the castle. If they succeeded, everything he had gained so far would be lost. Bruce's dream of an independent Scotland now rested on his guerrilla army beating the English in open battle. Edward II of England assembled a total of 18,000 men. He was supremely confident that Bruce's small guerrilla force would be no match for his massive army. This arrogance was to cost him dearly. The English crossed into Scotland on the 17th of June 1314 and pushed north towards Stirling. Edward's intention was to relieve the garrison besieged inside the castle and crush the Scots back into submission. On paper, Edward had a formidable array of troops at his disposal. The infantry made up the bulk of his army. However, the specialists were the archers and the cavalry, who were the medieval equivalent of machine guns and tanks. When these groups fought together, the results could be devastating. But the English army was not a cohesive unit. Edward's knights were the professional soldiers of their day. They represented the military and social elite of England. But in battle, these aristocrats often charged off on their own and fought completely independently from the peasants that made up the infantry. This drastically reduced their chances of victory. Bruce's Scottish army was significantly smaller than its English counterpart. However, it had three distinct advantages. First, most of his men were very experienced soldiers who had complete faith in their commanding officer. Second, they were fighting to defend their homes and liberate Scotland. Most importantly, prior to the Battle of Bannockburn, Bruce trained his men in revolutionary new tactics. The Scottish army was composed almost entirely of infantry, and the spear was their principal weapon. The Scots relied heavily on densely packed infantry formations called schiltrums. These spear walls were an excellent defense against cavalry. But history had taught Bruce that a lack of mobility made the schiltrums extremely vulnerable to attack from archers. Bruce's solution was to turn the military wisdom of the day on its head and use the schiltrum on the move. In the weeks before the battle, the Scottish king trained his infantry to advance in tight formation. Bruce knew this would make them a more difficult target for the English archers to hit. This tactical innovation also gave the schiltrum formations an offensive role. The wall of advancing spears could be used to literally push the enemy off the battlefield. As the English approached Stirling on the 23rd of June 1314, Bruce was uncertain as to whether these new tactics would be enough to overcome the huge odds stacked against him. Just under 7,000 Scots stood in the way of 18,000 Englishmen. It was the most formidable English army ever to have ventured north of the border. On the 17th of June 1314, Edward II of England crossed into Scotland, determined to relieve his men trapped inside Stirling Castle. The Scottish king, Robert Bruce, knew that if he failed to stop the English, his dream of independence would be lost. Believe it or not, 700 years ago, this was the location of one of the most decisive and bloody battles between Scotland and England. But this unlikely spot is exactly where Robert the Bruce chose to take on Edward II and his mighty English army. Although the modern-day city of Stirling now covers 2/3 of the battlefield, there are still places that let us understand how Bruce's knowledge of the area influenced his plan to defeat the English. In 1314, Stirling Castle was protected by the thick woodland of the New Park Forest. To the east, a small river called the Bannockburn bordered a large area of flat marshland known as the Carse of Balkiderick. There were only two ways to reach the castle: along an old Roman road and a narrow track called the Way. Bruce was outnumbered and knew he'd have to use the terrain to its best advantage if he was to stand any chance of victory. He divided his army into 3 divisions and placed them along the old Roman road between Stirling and Edward's army, effectively blocking the most direct route to the castle. The Scottish king had less than 7,000 troops. 2,500 men under the direct command of Bruce himself deployed along the southern edge of the New Park Forest. Another 2,000 infantry and 600 cavalry were hidden in the trees. The remaining 1,800 took up position next to St. Ninian's Church, overlooking the junction where the Roman road was joined by the Way. The English approached Stirling in complete disorder. Imagine 18,000 men, all their horses, carts and equipment, making their way along essentially what was little more than a track. Edward's army was stretched out for miles. With Edward and the main body of the English army slowly bringing up the rear, a vanguard of 1,500 knights set off to reconnoitre the route to Stirling Castle. They crossed the Bannockburn and moved up the Roman road towards the New Park Forest. The Scots moved out of the trees to confront the English. Within minutes, Edward's men found themselves facing a wall of spears. Robert Bruce was directly in front of his men, inspecting the deployment of the schiltrums, when he was spotted by an English knight. Sir Henry de Bohun must have thought this was his chance for fame and fortune. If he could kill the Scottish king in single combat, the Scots would be forced to surrender. Convinced his moment of glory had come, the young English knight couched his lance and charged. Bruce had 2 options. He could run or fight. But there was no way the Scottish king could show any weakness in front of his men. Mounted on a pony and armed only with a small battle axe, Bruce rose to the challenge. The 2 men hurtled towards each other. At the last moment, the Scottish king swerved and struck the English knight with a terrific blow to the head. De Bohun was dead before he hit the ground. Incensed, the rest of Edward's vanguard charged the Scots, but the schiltrums held firm. Many knights were killed, and when the Scottish cavalry charged out of the woods, the English turned and fled. During this battle, another 500 English knights had moved up the Way towards St. Ninian's in an attempt to find an alternative route to Stirling Castle. But Bruce had anticipated this move, and his men deployed near the church blocked the English. Edward's cavalry charged the schiltrum formations, but once again the Scottish infantry stood firm. Many horses and their riders were impaled on the spear wall, some of Bruce's infantry rushed forward and pulled knights down off their horses. The wounded were finished off as they lay sprawling on the ground. The English charged repeatedly, but found it impossible to break through. The second English vanguard was forced to retreat back across the Bannockburn. The plan to move up the two most obvious routes to Stirling Castle had been thwarted. The knights had expected the Scots to crumble or retreat, but Bruce's men had done neither. English confidence was now low. Exhausted from the day's fighting and the long march to Stirling, Edward's army retired to lick its wounds. Believing there was no immediate danger of attack, Edward's knights, a total of 2,000 men, moved onto the Carse of Balkiderick. They were to spend a miserable night crammed into this tiny area of boggy ground. Having only just arrived in the area, the English infantry, almost 16,000 men, remained on the other side of the Bannockburn. The decision to split their forces was to have disastrous consequences. The Scots moved back into the New Park Forest to camp for the night. Having beaten the English not once, but twice, their confidence was high. Yet despite their success, Bruce was unsure his small guerrilla army would be strong enough to overcome the English in a pitched battle. Bruce had to decide whether to risk everything in battle the following day or melt away into the hills. However, that night, a deserter arrived in the Scottish camp and told Bruce about the vulnerable position of the English troops. Receiving this news, Bruce knew that he would never have a better chance of victory. At dawn, the Scots moved out of the New Park and deployed into 3 divisions of 1,500 men. Bruce remained slightly to the rear at the head of a reserve division consisting of another 1,800 troops. He concealed his 600 cavalrymen in the forest. Bruce led his men in prayer. Watching from the other side of the Carse, Edward declared to his entourage that the Scots were asking for mercy. But a knight warned the English king, "They ask for mercy, but not from you. Those men will win all or die." The Scots began to advance towards the English. Edward's knights were completely taken aback by the sheer audacity of the Scottish offensive. Infantry attacking heavy cavalry, it simply wasn't done. But sure enough, the Scottish schiltrons were closing in on the English cavalry. Impulsively, Edward's knights rushed off the boggy ground of the Carse to confront the Scots. They hurriedly moved up the slope and onto a narrow stretch of dry field. They were now jammed together, sandwiched between a wood on one side and a river on the other. Lacking any overall strategy, small groups of Edward's men began to charge the Scottish line. But there was little room for maneuver, and the knights failed to build up any speed. Just like the previous day, their attempts to break the tightly packed schiltron formations came to nothing. The Scots pushed forward relentlessly and forced the English back onto the marshy ground. As Edward's cavalry retreated, a detachment of English archers moved up one side of the battlefield. Arrows began to rain down on the Scots, and for a moment it looked like the schiltrons might disintegrate. But Bruce had foreseen this eventuality. His small cavalry force poured out of the woods and scattered the English archers. Bruce ordered the schiltron under his direct command to reinforce the line. The entire Scottish army was now committed to the fight. The Scots formed a wall of spears that stretched right across the battlefield. and pushed the English back towards the Bannockburn River. Some of Edward's knights forced their way into the Scottish formations, but were quickly overwhelmed. Small groups of English infantry made their way across the river to help their beleaguered cavalry, but it wasn't enough to stop the Scots. Sensing victory, the Schiltrim surged forward and pushed the English down the steep slopes of this gorge. What was left of Edward's broken army was forced into the Bannockburn. The English were now fighting for their lives. A few brave individuals tried to make a last stand, but were hacked down. Others were cut to pieces as they desperately tried to cross the river. Most of Edward's 16,000 infantry were completely oblivious to the carnage. When they finally learned what was happening on the other side of the river, it was too late to help. With the battle now over, they were left with no choice but to retreat south. Edward fled the battlefield and made straight for Stirling Castle. However, with the Scots victorious, the English commander trapped inside its walls was duty-bound to honour his agreement to surrender. Edward had no intention of becoming prisoner, so was forced to move on. As Edward began his long trek back to England, over 1,000 of his men lay dead on the battlefield. Thousands more were forced to surrender. Bruce had lost only 400 men. To complete the victory, the Scots captured the English war chest containing gold worth over £50 million in today's money. Here at Bannockburn, the forward-moving Scottish Schiltrim humbled England's military elite. The offensive use of a spear wall went on to become standard military practice throughout Europe for the next 400 years. And this great battle confirmed Robert Bruce as King of an independent Scotland.